On a quiet night in March 2014, a passenger jet lifted into the sky and seemed to vanish into thin air. No mayday call, no crash site, no wreckage in the waves. For 239 people on board, the world simply fell silent, and that silence has haunted us ever since. Governments poured hundreds of millions of dollars into the ocean, scanning, searching, and dragging the seabed, but the truth refused to surface. What was supposed to be the most advanced investigation in aviation history became one of its darkest mysteries. Every fragment of debris that washed ashore only deepened the question: how could a modern Boeing 777 disappear in an age of satellites, radar, and constant surveillance? And then, years later, a retired British engineer stepped forward with a claim that stunned even the most skeptical.
In my view, there's no reason why we shouldn't be preparing a new search and planning. It will only take one more search, and we will find it.
He said he had found a way to follow the ghostly traces the plane left behind. He said he knew where MH370 truly rests. The only question left is, could he finally be right? The disappearance of Malaysia Airlines. Flight MH370 shocked the world. On March 8, 2014, the plane took off from Kuala Lumpur at 12:41 a.m., carrying 239 people. The journey seemed like any other routine, calm, uneventful. But just 38 minutes into the flight, everything changed. At 1:19 a.m., the last words heard from the cockpit were a simple, "Good night, Malaysian 370. 2 minutes later, the transponder went dark. To the world, the plane had vanished. The search began immediately, but what followed was a mystery that would stretch for years. Authorities combed through satellite data, radar logs, and even analyzed drifting debris. Yet every lead seemed to bring more questions than answers. One crucial piece of evidence, the satellite pings, suggested the plane flew for several more hours after it disappeared from radar. This bizarre finding only added to the growing confusion. What should have been an easy explanation soon turned into an international riddle. Why did the plane change course so sharply? What happened in those final hours before it seemingly disappeared without a trace? As the search for answers stalled, the official theories began to unravel. The world needed answers, but they weren't coming. That's when Richard Godfrey, a retired aerospace engineer, decided to dig deeper than anyone else, and what he uncovered would challenge everything we thought we knew about MH370. For almost a decade, the most convenient explanation for the disappearance of MH370 has been the idea of pilot self-harm. It was a story that sounded simple, and it gave officials a theory to lean on when there was nothing else concrete to hold. To the public, it tied up loose ends. But when we look closer, the data tells a story that doesn't match this neat conclusion. Inmarsat, a company that handled communications with the plane, recorded signals during the final hours of the flight. Hidden inside those pings are measurements known as burst frequency offset, or BFO. You can think of BFO like the pitch of a note. If the pitch drops suddenly, it means the object making the sound is falling fast. And the final reading from MH370 doesn't drift downward, it plunges. This single piece of data points not to a smooth descent, but to a violent drop. If the captain had truly guided the aircraft into the ocean in a calm, deliberate way, the Boeing 777 would have shown clear signs of preparation. One of the strongest clues lies in the flaps, the panels on the wings that extend when a pilot wants to slow down for landing. Without them, the plane cannot safely reduce its speed to touch the water in one piece. But debris from the aircraft, recovered years later on remote beaches, showed no evidence that the flaps were ever deployed. Instead, the damage revealed something far more chaotic. Pieces of wreckage bore the scars of stress far beyond normal limits, edges twisted like paper. Surfaces showed signs of flutter, a violent vibration that shakes a structure until it tears apart. Other parts carried overload fractures, the unmistakable fingerprints of an aircraft forced into conditions it was never designed to endure. This is not the wreckage of a plane carefully ditched on the waves. It is the wreckage of a machine that struck the ocean at terrifying speed. And yet, despite the evidence, the pilot's self-harm story held on. For officials, it was convenient. It explained the mystery without the need to find the wreck. For the media, it was easy to repeat, but for the families, the story was unbearable. It was not just that they lost loved ones, it was that the theory offered to them felt false. The explanation was too clean for the mess that reality had left behind. To understand why this matters, it helps to break down the technical side in plain language. Inmarsat measured two things: BFO, the pitch of the signal, and BTO, which you can imagine as a timestamp showing how far the plane was from the satellite. Together, they gave investigators a rough idea of the aircraft's path. But it was the BFO, the shift in the pitch of that signal, that screamed of a descent so steep it could only end in catastrophe. Once you grasp that, the idea of a slow, controlled glide into the sea collapses completely. This leaves us with a painful contradiction. On one hand, the official story is that the pilot calmly ended the flight. On the other, the physical evidence of a dive so violent that no ditching could have taken place. In between those two versions of events, the families were left stranded, forced to live with a theory that did not align with the truth buried in the data. And so the question that refuses to fade comes into view. If MH370's final moments were violent and uncontrolled, then why did the search continue in places that only made sense for a gentle glide? When satellite data and wreckage fragments left more questions than answers, one man decided to look somewhere nobody else had bothered to search. His name is Richard Godfrey, a retired British aerospace engineer with a mind that never stopped solving puzzles. While officials clung to traditional radar and satellite tracking, Godfrey turned his attention to something quieter, something hidden in plain sight. A global network of faint radio signals that wrapped around the Earth like a spider web. This was the Whisper Grid. Around the world, amateur radio operators constantly send signals that bounce between the ground and the ionosphere, the charged layer high above the planet. Most of the time, these signals travel cleanly from one station to another, leaving behind digital logs of their journey. But sometimes, when a large object crosses their path, the signals bend or fade. That disturbance, barely noticeable in the moment, is captured and stored. To most people, it is noise. To Godfrey, it was a trail. He realized that a massive aircraft like a Boeing 777 would leave fingerprints as it cut across these invisible threads. Each crossing would create a ripple, a tiny disruption etched into the radio logbooks. And because the network of signals spans the globe, he believed those ripples could be pieced together like breadcrumbs. If MH370 had truly crossed the Indian Ocean, then it would have walked across this web, step by step, leaving faint but undeniable marks. Godfrey began to dig. He gathered years of archived transmissions, stripping away background interference from the sun and the shifting ionosphere. What remained, after filters and careful analysis, were signals that lined up with the known moments of MH370's last flight. The whisper grid, ignored by everyone else, was now revealing a possible path. But how could people understand this without the technical jargon? Imagine standing in a quiet forest and hearing faint echoes of someone passing between the trees. You don't see them, but the echoes prove they were there. That is what these radio logs are. Echoes recorded at the very moment a giant aircraft disturbed the invisible sky. The method became known as WSPR, short for Weak Signal Propagation Reporter. It sounds complex, but the core idea is simple. Every time a signal is sent and received, it notes the time and path. If something interrupts that path, the change is logged forever. Now, take thousands of these logs scattered across continents, and you begin to see a trail no one thought existed. For Godfrey, this was not just an experiment. It was the chance to answer a question that had haunted the world for years. Families of the missing were still waiting, still clinging to hope that someone, somewhere, could bring clarity. And here was a man sifting through the digital noise of the planet, pulling out clues everyone else had overlooked. Slowly, the lines began to connect. The disturbances matched the time MH370 vanished from radar. They pointed south into the emptiness of the Indian Ocean. Step by step, breadcrumb by breadcrumb, the path was becoming clear. If the evidence held, then for the first time, there was a way to see where the plane had gone, without wreckage, without eyewitnesses, and without relying on theories that did not match the facts. But this discovery also raised the stakes. Because if these breadcrumbs were real, they were leading investigators into a region that had never been searched before. And that opened up a chilling twist. If the whisper grid was telling the truth, had the world been looking in the wrong place all along? Richard Godfrey's work with the whisper grid did not stop at theory. Once he realized the signals contained disturbances at the right times, he pushed deeper, testing whether they could sketch an actual path across the Indian Ocean. What he uncovered was not random static. It was a line, faint but persistent, that seemed to mirror the last known position of MH370. The trail began where military radar in Malaysia had caught its final blip before the plane turned away from the busy skies of Southeast Asia. From there, the disturbances curved southwest, away from land, away from all known routes, into one of the loneliest regions of the planet. Hour by hour, the fingerprints in the data pointed further south until they settled on a path that cut straight into the emptiness of the Indian Ocean. This was no vague suggestion. It was a line drawn through thousands of data points, each one a tiny breadcrumb left behind by a jet that should not have been traceable at all. Godfrey's filters removed false signals from solar storms, from shifting radio layers, and from natural noise that could confuse the picture. What survived those tests carried the weight of precision, and that precision painted a chilling route. The plane had not glided to a careful landing, as some had claimed. It had flown long and straight, then plunged into a stretch of sea so deep and so uncharted that even the most expensive searches had left it untouched. The coordinates that rose from the analysis were exact, near 29.128 degrees south and 99.934 degrees east. This was not inside the original search zones that ships had scoured for years. It was just beyond them, in waters that had never been mapped with the detail needed to spot a wreck. For families, this was both heartbreaking and electrifying. Heartbreaking because it suggested their loved ones had been waiting in the dark for years while search teams looked in the wrong direction. Electrifying because for the first time, someone had offered a target more precise than somewhere in the southern Indian Ocean. The power of the method became clear when explained in simple terms. Every time MH370 crossed one of these invisible radio threads, it was like leaving a footprint in wet sand. One footprint on its own proves little, but dozens in a row mark out a trail. And when those trails intersect, they narrow the possible location from an ocean-wide mystery to a corridor only tens of kilometers across. Godfrey's map looked like a ghost trail laid over the Indian Ocean, invisible to the eye but undeniable in its consistency. It curved and shifted just as an aircraft of that size and speed would, matching the timeline down to the minute. This was not imagination drawing shapes in clouds. It was evidence, logged and stored long before anyone knew to look for it. Still, the discovery brought its own haunting question. Was this breakthrough real insight, or was it the human brain finding patterns where none existed? Skeptics called it pattern hunting, but Godfrey pressed on, convinced the data was more than coincidence. And as independent checks began to align with his findings, the doubts slowly started to shrink. For the first time since 2014, the ocean no longer looked endless. It looked like a map with an X drawn on it. And that X lay in a place untouched by every previous search, which led to the question nobody could ignore. If this trail was genuine and the breadcrumbs were leading us here, had the world been circling the wrong waters for nearly a decade? When Richard Godfrey laid out his trail of radio breadcrumbs, many asked the same question. How do we know this is real and not just a clever illusion? The answer came when the anomalies he tracked began to line up with other sources of evidence, creating a web too tight to ignore. The first cross-check came from the Inmarsat satellites. These were the same signals that had given investigators the BFO and BTO numbers years earlier, the ones that suggested a violent descent. What shocked analysts was that the disturbances on the Whisper grid matched those satellite handshakes almost to the minute. Every time MH370 connected with the satellite, the WSPR network showed its own ripple. Two completely different systems, one built for aviation, the other for hobby radio, were recording the same ghostly steps across the ocean. The second cross-check came from the sea itself. After the crash, pieces of MH370 eventually began to wash ashore in Africa and the islands of the Indian Ocean. At first, these fragments looked like isolated tragedies. But when oceanographers traced back the drift of those pieces using current models, the lines pointed toward the same region Godfrey had identified. It was as if the sea had carried whispers of the wreck all the way to distant beaches, and those whispers agreed with the radio trail. Then came a test that silenced many critics. If the WSPR method truly worked, it should be able to detect an aircraft that everyone knew was flying. So a Boeing 777 was flown deliberately along a corridor intersecting multiple radio signals. As it crossed those invisible threads, the disturbances appeared exactly where they should, recorded in real time. For investigators, it was a turning point. The Whisper grid was not just theory. It was a living, breathing detection system hidden in plain sight. One that could catch a 300-ton airliner moving through the sky. Explaining this to the public required simple images. Think of a bottle dropped into the sea. If it drifts ashore years later, scientists can trace the currents backward to find where it came from. Now replace the bottle with aircraft debris and the currents tell a story pointing south. Or think of a bell ringing in the dark. Every time something passes between you and the bell, the sound bends for a moment. That is what the radio signals were doing. They were bells ringing across the planet, and MH370 had walked through them, leaving echoes behind. Together, these independent checks painted a picture that was hard to dismiss. Satellites, ocean drift, and live flight tests were all converging on the same region of ocean. Each on its own might be questioned, but all three together formed a triangle of evidence that was too sharp to ignore. And yet, there was still an unsettling twist. As the months went by and more data was processed, the exact location seemed to shift slightly. Not wildly, but enough to raise eyebrows. Each refinement narrowed the box, tightening the coordinates, making the target smaller and smaller. To some, this looked like the theory was moving the goalposts. To others, it looked like science doing what it always does, refining itself as more pieces fall into place. For the families, these cross-checks were more than numbers. They were lifelines, proof that someone, somewhere, was still fighting to bring clarity after a decade of silence. But with each new confirmation, another question grew louder. If all these lines of evidence pointed to the same place, then why, after all this time, was the wreck still missing? At first, Richard Godfrey's map of MH370's final path seemed like a moving target. Each pass through the data added more detail, and sometimes the coordinates shifted by a few miles. Critics seized on this, saying it proved the method was unreliable. But that was not what was happening. This was the natural sharpening of a picture that had been blurry for years. In the early stages, the radio disturbances simply showed a general corridor stretching into the southern Indian Ocean. It was as if you knew someone had walked through a field at night, but you could only see the outline of their trail. The more signals Godfrey pulled in, the clearer the footprints became. And over months of refining filters, testing noise, and comparing with satellite timings, the target began to shrink. It shrank from hundreds of kilometers to a box only a few dozen wide. By late 2021, the coordinates had locked in around 29 degrees south, near longitude 99 east. The wobbling trail had hardened into a fixed box. For families of the missing, this moment felt like the first solid ground after years of shifting theories. Finally, there was a place to point to on a map, not just an endless sweep of ocean. But the challenge was staggering. This box lay in one of the harshest marine environments on Earth, where depths plunged to nearly 6,000 meters and the seabed is as rugged as mountains. Previous searches had skipped this patch, not because it was impossible, but because time and money were running out. Now, with a sharper target, there was reason to go back. And that is where a private company stepped in. Ocean Infinity, a deep-sea exploration firm based in Texas, had already made headlines by using fleets of autonomous underwater vehicles, or AUVs, to scan vast tracts of ocean floor. They had worked on other missing ship and plane cases, building a reputation for precision. Their technology was a leap ahead of what earlier searches had relied on. Instead of dragging sonar across the seafloor with a single ship, Ocean Infinity deployed multiple robot subs at once. Each one carried high-resolution sonar and could dive 6 kilometers deep, mapping the seabed in strips until the entire area was covered. The method was fast, efficient, and left little room for blind spots. Malaysia struck a deal with the company in 2018, but with a unique twist. It was a no-fine, no-fee contract. If Ocean Infinity found nothing, they would not be paid. It was a gamble that showed both the desperation of the search and the confidence in this new approach. The first mission had ended without success, but now, armed with Godfrey's coordinates, Ocean Infinity was preparing to return. This time, the search zone was not a vague sweep of tens of thousands of square kilometers. It was a box of around 15,000 square kilometers, sharpened by radio signals, drift models, and cross-checks. For the first time, the hunt had the feel of a final chapter. Explaining the technology is easier than it sounds. Picture a lawn being mowed, but instead of grass, it is the ocean floor. Each AUV sweeps a strip, then another moves alongside it, and together they leave no gaps. The sonar pings bounce back, sketching out ridges, valleys, and objects that stand out against the seabed. If the wreck of MH370 lies there, the sonar will not miss it. The stakes could not be higher, because what waits at the bottom is not just metal and wires. It is the key to the final minutes of the flight. The angle of impact, the condition of the engines, the position of the flaps, all of it can tell a story about what truly happened in those last moments. For years, the world has argued about whether the captain ended the flight on purpose or if a sudden catastrophe forced it down. The wreckage, if found, will hold the answers. Every twisted panel, every broken joint, every black box recorder could rewrite the story that officials once thought was finished. And so, the moving target has become a fixed box, one that now holds the weight of truth and closure, but another question lingers like a shadow. If the seabed really does reveal the wreck, will it confirm the official story, or will it expose a darker, more complex chain of events that has been hidden for over a decade? For years, the official narrative painted a simple ending: a pilot who lost control of himself, a plane that slipped quietly into the sea, and a mystery that could never be solved. But the evidence has never matched that neat version of events. The satellite signals pointed to a violent fall. The fragments that washed ashore spoke of chaos, not control. And now the whisper grid, the drift patterns, and the new search technology all point toward a box of ocean where the answers may finally wait. This story is no longer just about data. It is about families who deserve closure and a world that needs to learn from what went wrong. Because somewhere in that deep trench, the truth is resting, silent but intact. And when it is found, the question will not be whether we can handle the answers, but whether we are ready to face what they reveal.